Welcome to Black History in Upstate New York. This program was produced by Victoria Basulto in conjunction with the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum and funded by the Catherine W. Davis Projects for Peace Fellowship awarded through Colgate University. Black History in Upstate New York will provide a combination of bite-sized informational videos and longer presentations by scholars on historical figures and places that emphasize the crucial role Black Americans have played in the history of upstate New York. The National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum honors anti-slavery abolitionists, their work to end slavery and the legacy of that struggle, and strives to complete the second and ongoing abolition, the moral conviction to end racism. Hello, and once again, welcome to Black History in Upstate New York. My name is Victoria Basulto, and it is my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Talima Aaron. Since joining the John W. Jones Board of Trustees Finance Committee in 2004, Talima has advanced the museum's restoration, preservation, and education efforts. The need to fund these objectives led her to write state and local grants totaling over $350,000, which were key in stabilizing and restoring the building. From 2008 to 2016, she served as second vice president and was elected president of the board in June 2016. Throughout Talima's time as a trustee, her work included fundraising, grant writing, creating branded items, and organizing events, all in support of the museum's mission. Under her leadership, the museum opened its doors to the public in 2016. For the past 3 years, Talima partnered with the Elmira YWCA to offer a film screening and panel discussion to celebrate Black History Month. Over 400 participants attended the 2020 program, which featured the movie Harriet. Talima retired from Corning Incorporated Science and Technology's Human Resource Training Team in April 2016 after 11 years of service. She also retired from Aetna Life and Casualties Travelers in 2000 with 20 years of service. While at Aetna, she received her Charter Property Casualty Underwriter designation, managed a team of underwriters raters, and facilitated training for insurance professionals. Talima is a graduate of the State University of New York and completed the Human Resources and Train-the-Trainer programs at the Cornell University's School of Industrial Relations. A native of New York City, wife, mother, and proud grandmother, Talima has lived in Elmira for over 40 years. I'd like to now invite Talima to begin her presentation.
Thank you, Victoria, for your wonderful introduction and invitation to present John W. Jones. I also want to thank the National Abolition Hall of Fame for hosting this series. John W. Jones' passing did not go unnoticed. A headline in the Elmira Daily Gazette and Free Press dated December 27, 1900 read, "Death of a prominent colored citizen, born a slave, died rich, originator of the Underground Railroad." The life and death of this well-known and esteemed citizen was newsworthy. On December the 26th, 1900, Mr. Jones, aged 83, died at his home in Elmira, New York, after battling pneumonia for a few weeks. Jones, a loved and respected Black man, had amassed what was considered a fortune. In fact, he was the wealthiest Black man in the region and one of the few rich Black men in the state. And this notice appeared in another newspaper. The funeral of John W. Jones, the most noted colored or mulatto citizen of Elmira, a former slave in the South, and a man of rare intelligence and considerable wealth, took place in that city December the 29th and was numerously attended. He was for many years the sexton and usher of the First Baptist Church of Elmira and was highly respected and esteemed for his many good qualities and gentlemanly manners. Why was John W. Jones so respected and honored? Who was he? Accounts of his life of service, recorded in newspapers, books, and letters, help to give perspective and context to the complex history of Mr. John W. Jones. It is through this lens you see Jones demonstrate his conviction and strong character, which are shaped by his values and commitment to social justice and racial equality. John W. Jones's first act of defiance against the institution of slavery was to plan and execute his and four other freedom seekers' successful escape when he was 27 years old. After walking almost 300 miles, they reached the farm of Nathaniel Smith in Bradford County, Pennsylvania, and crawled into his barn and slept. Mrs. Sarah Smith discovered the fugitives and fed them for nearly a week until they were well enough to travel again. They arrived in Elmira, July 1844, a month after they first set out. Once they settled in Elmira, John Jones quickly established himself as a smart and industrious citizen. He had several jobs, including working as sexton of First Baptist Church, a position he held for nearly 43 years. Using the money he saved and the salary he earned as a sexton, Jones purchased his first home for $500, a small yellow house next to the church. As the station master of the Underground Railroad, John Jones sheltered as many as 30 people at once in the little yellow house by the railroad that was his home, coordinating the efforts of local supporters and other abolitionists, such as the Langdons, the Beechers, and the Thurstons. With the passing of the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law, the Underground Railroad was quickly formed despite the harsh penalties that the law imposed on sympathizers. Elmira was the last published station between Philadelphia and Canada on the Underground Railroad. Jones quietly took command of the Underground in Elmira. Freedom seekers were funneled to Elmira from Harrisburg and Philadelphia en route to St. Catharines in Canada. During the period when the Fugitive Slave Law was in force, it was expected that its provisions would be enforced against John, but his open standing declaration was that he would never be taken alive, and his acquaintances knew what such a declaration meant. For over 9 years, Jones worked courageously, developing and maintaining relationships with local abolitionists and railroad personnel for the safe escape of the freedom seekers. By the end of this period before emancipation, Jones had directed nearly 800 fugitives to freedom, most landing in St. Catharines, Ontario. Jones worked with William Still, the famous Black freeman, and the chief underground agent in Philadelphia. He forwarded parties of from 6 to 10 fugitives at a time to Jones in Elmira. Jones's June 1860 letter to William Still, which William Still included in his book, The Underground Railroad, not only establishes his connections beyond a doubt to the Underground Railroad, it also shows his resolve to the cause. A wry sense of humor is glimpsed toward the end of this letter. Friend William Still, all 6 came to this place last night, about 12 o'clock. The man and woman stopped at the depot and went east on the next train, about 18 miles, and did not get back till tonight, so that the 2 men went this morning and the 4 went this evening. Oh, master, don't cry for me, for I am going to Canada where colored men are free. P.S. What is the news from the city? Will you tell me how many you've sent over to Canada? I would like to know. They all send their love to you. I have nothing new to tell you. We are all in good health. I see there is a law passed in Maryland not to set any slaves free. They had better get the consent of the Underground Railroad before they pass such a thing. Good night from your friend, John W. Jones. During the years leading to the Civil War, Jones was extremely busy. While earning a living during the day and saving lives under the cover of night, Jones also worked within the Black community as a member of an organization dedicated to freedom. In 1850, the Elmira Colored Citizens Committee was formed. John Jones was chosen as secretary and also as one of the 5 men appointed to prepare resolutions. Jones helped draft, then recorded these first resolutions that were unanimously adopted by the new committee. The 4 resolutions were designed to protect themselves from slave catchers and protest the Fugitive Slave Act. The last directed its members to treat anyone aiding a slave catcher as an enemy. John Jones was not passive in his quest for equality and actively fought against injustice, especially the institution of slavery. As he worked in secrecy for the Underground Railroad, Jones was otherwise openly vocal and sometimes physical in expressing his dedication and conviction. In a newspaper article dated July 17, 1854, a notice appeared that a man described as a black rascal had presented himself as a fugitive slave. He had collected almost $5 from abolition sympathizers before he was recognized by a colored man who had seen him in Buffalo a few weeks before. John Jones pursued the beggar and kicked him severely. The article concludes with Jones making this statement: "Such fellows will do great injury to the actual fugitive by creating in the minds of the directors of the Underground Railroad strong suspicions that they are not what they represent themselves to be." Another article illustrates Jones' leadership skills as he used his powers of diplomacy to de-escalate an angry mob and avert a potential riot. In 1858, an old black man, crippled by rheumatism, had escaped from Maryland and made it to Canada. He was unable to work and could not secure enough food and clothing. Tired and discouraged, he sent word to his master to come and take him back to Maryland. His master complied and they headed back south, staying overnight in Elmira. An angry crowd of armed Negroes swarmed the hotel because they thought the white man was a slave catcher with a captured fugitive. John Jones, who was told of the situation, went to the hotel and demanded that the man be brought out or there would be trouble. The man was brought out on the balcony. John Jones questions him. Was he willing to return to slavery? He was. Did he love slavery better than liberty? Under his circumstances, he did. He went back of his own free will and accord. He did. Amen, said John Jones in conclusion. Go back then. You are not the kind of man we want in this county. That settled the matter and ended the trouble. No resident of Elmira, white or colored, ever commanded greater respect and admiration from everyone, without exception, than this noble Christian gentleman. It's an excerpt from the book, The Elmira Prison Camp by Clay W. Holmes. Jones, who was already sexton of the new Woodlawn Cemetery, was hired as sexton of the small plot of land adjacent for the burial of the Confederate soldiers who died in the Elmira Civil War prison camp. Jones renegotiated his monthly fee of $40 to $2.50 per burial when the deaths began to mount. He supervised a crew of up to 12 men for the burials, but was present for each, ensuring that they were done properly. Jones kept meticulous records, enabling the dead to be identified. Only 7 of the 2,973 were unidentified, but they were not just numbers to him. He saw the humanity in the young men dying so far from home and took great pains to gather as much information about each soldier he was burying. In every coffin was a sealed bottle with a paper telling the name, rank, company, regiment, date of death, and grave number. At the head of each grave, he placed a wooden slab with a name and a number on it. Then Jones wrote down every record in a book. One day he saw a familiar name on one of the coffins and recognized it as the son of his overseer back in Virginia. The boy was a favorite child when John escaped, and the boy's mother had treated John kindly. John laid the body away reverently, then wrote to Leesburg and confirmed that this was indeed the same young man. The name does not appear on the list of the dead, and it is assumed that his body was later sent home, one of only 3 removed after the war. It is ironic that one who was a slave kept the careful records that allow for this history to exist today, especially since Jones, who was uneducated, was refused entry to both schools in Elmira. If Judge Thurston, who employed Jones at the time and recognized his intelligence, had not used his influence for Jones to be admitted to a school, history would have suffered. John Jones received only 1 season of formal education, and with that education, he made history. In 1877, the federal government designated Woodlawn as a national cemetery and replaced the wooden markers with the identical headstones that you see today. They are inscribed with the information from John Jones's records. The federal government also used his documentation to make a drawing showing every grave and number. The following tribute is paid to John W. Jones in the book, The Elmira Prison Camp. The history of Elmira's prison camp is unique in one striking particular. The last sad rites paid to those Confederate soldiers who died in prison were performed by one who was born a slave. History does not record anything to challenge the assertion that at no prison, North or South, were the dead so reverently cared for, or a more perfect record kept, and this by a former slave. A final note about the character of John W. Jones. Many years earlier, Mrs. Sarah Smith died and was buried in Woodlawn Cemetery, according to a 1950 Star Gazette article. With Jones's passing, a mystery was solved. Each week, a bouquet had appeared on the grave of Mrs. Smith, who had befriended a group of slaves in 1844. None knew whence they came, and they stopped with John's heart. Not until then did it become certain whose hand had arranged them with such loving regularity. Today, in addition to the John W. Jones Museum, you can visit tributes to Mr. Jones and his legacy around the city of Elmira. Located inside the entrance to Woodlawn's National Cemetery is a plaque installed in 1937 from the Daughters of the Confederacy, honoring Jones's compassionate and respectful internment of the Confederate soldiers who died in the Elmira prison ward camp. In 1953, the city of Elmira opened its first public housing development. It is in his honor that they chose to name it John W. Jones Court. Although the buildings were renamed in 2019 by its new owners, the apartments were recently renovated and individuals and families are making it their home once again. Students of Elmira Southside High School's diversity group, known as the Jones Nine, and community members dedicated this memorial stone on June 22, 1997, which is installed on his grave in Woodlawn Cemetery. Here's a brief timeline of the second home and only artifact owned by Jones and how it became a museum. This is the only picture that we know exists of the farmhouse where he and his family lived from 1866 to 1900. Here he grew fruit trees and crops such as buckwheat, oats, wheat, potatoes, and hay. Originally just outside of town, the house, modest and meticulously kept, is located on College Ave. Built on 16 acres of land, its unique structure was constructed in the Southern style to resemble the homes in Virginia of his enslaved youth. The house is in an open field until moved from College Ave to Woodlawn Ave in 1955. The house changed ownership several times and was last used as a rental property that fell into disrepair. Vacant and condemned by the city of Elmira in 1997, Lucy Brown leads the initiative to save the house by bringing it to the community's attention. The building is spared because of its historical significance and is bought by the newly formed John W. Jones Museum Trustee Board in 1998. The house is moved in 2000 to its current and final location on Davis Street, across from Woodlawn Cemetery. All moves repositioned the house on what was once Jones's original farmland. After stabilizing the structure, the building was restored to visually interpret Jones's farmhouse externally to be used as a museum and visitor center. Listed on the State National Register of Historic Places and designated as a New York State Underground Railroad Heritage Trail site, the John W. Jones Museum opened its doors to the public in June 2016. The grounds include a heritage garden, and plans for further site development include adding a statue of Mr. Jones in 2022 and building the Lucy Brown Education and Heritage and Interpretation Center named for the museum's founder. So let's stay in touch. We need your support to protect and preserve this historic property for future generations. It is so important that we share the full American stories that help shape our nation and that no contribution is ever forgotten. So you can visit the museum at our street address, 1250 Davis Street, Elmira, New York. You can check out our website and visit us through our virtual tour. You can contact us via email. And of course, your support is appreciated. So you can donate via PayPal or mail your check to our P.O. Box. Thank you so much for listening to this presentation.
I'd like to thank Talima Aaron for that wonderful presentation. I'd also like to thank you, the audience, for joining us today. To re-emphasize some of the points Talima made, I highly recommend that you visit the John W. Jones Museum's website at www.johnwjonesmuseum.org. This will allow you to stay in touch with all the updates for what the museum is doing to preserve Jones's legacy in Elmira, New York. If you're in the area, I also recommend that you visit the physical location at 1250 Davis Street, Elmira, New York. Lastly, please fill out the survey whose link is available on your screen as well as in the video description. This will allow you to provide feedback about the specific presentation or the program in general. Your feedback will help us in the formulation of future presentations and programs like this one. Thank you, and I hope we see you again tomorrow.